She had spent 3 years and close to $900,000 trying to get that car to run again. 900,000. 3 years. 11 specialists brought in from Vancouver, Toronto, one from Stuttgart who flew business class and billed accordingly. And still nothing. The 1969 Jaguar E-Type sat in the climate-controlled bay of her family's estate outside Kelowna, like something between a museum piece and a wound. Beautiful, unreachable, silent as the man who had left it to her. Eleanor Voss was not a woman who accepted no for an answer. She had built a commercial real estate portfolio across British Columbia that made her one of the more quietly powerful people in the province. The kind of power that doesn't announce itself at galas, but shows up in who returns your calls on a Sunday. She was 61 years old, precise, unhurried in the way of someone who had learned that urgency is mostly performance. She had managed the death of her husband, the restructuring of 2 companies, and a legal dispute with a former partner that had lasted 4 years, all without visibly losing her footing. She could not manage this. The Jaguar had belonged to her father, Bernard, who had restored it himself over 11 years in the garage behind the house in Penticton, where Eleanor grew up. Bernard Voss had been a machinist, not wealthy, not famous, the kind of man who smelled like metal shavings, and wore the same style of plaid shirt every day of his adult life, and who had very specific opinions about how a socket wrench should be held. He had bought the Jaguar as a wreck in 1978 for $800 from a farmer outside Oliver who needed the space. He finished it in 1989. Eleanor remembered the day it first ran. She was 12. She had been doing homework at the kitchen table, and the sound had come through the walls of the house, this enormous, alive, slightly threatening sound. And she had run outside without her shoes, and her father was standing in the driveway, grinning in a way she had never quite seen before, and would not see again until the day she graduated from university. He drove it twice a year, never in winter, never on wet roads. He kept it under a canvas cover in the garage and checked on it the way some men check on sleeping children. He died at 78, and Eleanor had the Jaguar transported to Kelowna because it was the right thing to do, and because she had made herself a promise standing in the driveway of the Penticton house the morning after the funeral, with frost still on the grass and the canvas cover half pulled back, her hand flat against the cold green paint. She would get it running again. She would hear it again. That was 3 years ago. The first specialist had come from Vancouver, a classic car restoration outfit, with a good reputation and a very professional invoice. They spent a week. The problem was electrical, they said, though the engine itself was mechanically remarkable for its age. Something in the wiring harness. They had a theory. The theory didn't pan out. They sent a detailed report and left. Eleanor read the report and understood perhaps a quarter of it and called someone else. The Stuttgart man was the 5th. He had published a monograph on British sports car electrical systems from the 1960s. He spent 9 days. He came closer than anyone, he said. He identified the fault to a specific system before the trail went cold. He called Eleanor personally to tell her, which she appreciated. He said the car had been modified at some point before her father bought it. Not badly. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. But the modification created a diagnostic blind spot. The standard tools missed it. She paid him double his rate. The Jaguar sat. By the 3rd year, $900,000 had accumulated in repair invoices, specialist fees, shipping costs, custom diagnostic equipment built for this specific car by 2 separate firms. $900,000 was not a sum that registered meaningfully against Eleanor Voss's net worth. But that had never been the point. The point was the promise. The point was the morning in Penticton with the frost and the canvas cover and the specific quality of grief that attached itself to objects the way it couldn't quite attach to air. She had not been able to keep the promise. On a Tuesday in September, the 12th specialist left. His name was Dr. Frederick Halle, a man of significant professional reputation in the field of vintage European automotive restoration, who had been recommended by 3 separate contacts as the last word on this category of problem. He had arrived with 2 assistants and equipment that filled a cube van. He stayed 11 days. Eleanor found him standing outside the garage bay on the morning of the 11th day. His assistants were loading equipment. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and a look on his face that she had learned, over the course of 12 such conversations, to recognize. It was the look of a person who had built a professional identity around being the last resort, and was now confronting the edges of that identity. "Miss Voss," he said, "I need to tell you I haven't been able to solve this." She had heard it before. It still arrived like something blunt. He said the fault was present somewhere in the integration between two systems. The diagnostic instruments could detect the effects, but not the origin. Without the origin, any repair attempt was guesswork, and guesswork on this car risked making things worse. She thanked him. She waited until his van pulled out of the gate before going back inside the bay. She stood beside the Jaguar for a long time. The September light came in through the high windows at a low angle and hit the paint in a way that was almost hard to look at. Green, the color of something deep underwater. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, breathed in slowly. That's enough, she thought. That's the last one. She wasn't sure she believed it. She heard footsteps on the concrete outside the bay and turned. The man standing in the doorway had clearly not expected anyone to be in there. He was holding a clipboard and wearing a gray work jacket with the name of the property maintenance company stitched on the chest. He was perhaps 40, maybe a few years either side, with dark hair that was starting to get long and the kind of build that came from actual physical labor. He had grease on his left forearm that he hadn't noticed. His eyes went from Eleanor to the Jaguar and back with an expression she couldn't entirely parse. He said, "Sorry, I was checking the drainage on the east side. I can come back." She said, "It's fine." He was already starting to turn when something made her speak again. She wasn't sure why. She had not said it out loud to anyone in 3 years, not in those exact numbers, not with that specific arithmetic. 12 specialists, she said. 3 years, $900,000. Nobody can fix it. He stopped. He looked at the car, not at her. At the car, the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand rather than something they're being polite about. "What's the problem?" he asked. Not with sympathy, just asking. "Electrical. They can see the effects, but nobody can find the origin of the fault." He was quiet for a moment. She could see something happening in his face, not recognition exactly. More like the expression of someone hearing a specific word in a conversation and adjusting slightly toward it. "What year?" he asked. 69, Series 2, another silence. And then Eleanor Voss, who had not made a joke in 3 years about this car, and had in fact stopped allowing herself to feel anything sardonic about it, because the situation had long since passed the point where that was available to her, heard herself say, "Maybe you should have a look." She said it the way you say something when you have run out of road. Half nothing, the smallest possible commitment. An offering made to the air rather than to any particular person. He looked at her, not at the Jaguar, at her. "I can try," he said. No hesitation. "No, well, I'm not really a car guy, or I don't know much about this kind of thing. Just a flat, plain I can try, in the same tone you'd use to say you could have a look at a leaking gutter." Eleanor stared at him for a moment. "All right," she said, because she had no better response available. His name was James Croft. She learned this from the clipboard he set against the wall before crouching beside the open engine bay. He had a daughter. She learned later that evening from her property manager when she asked who this person was. 8 years old, a girl named Fiona. He'd had her with him 3 days that week because of some schedule change at her school, and Fiona had spent those 3 days reading in the back seat of James's truck in the driveway, apparently entirely content with this arrangement. He was a widower. The property manager said it the way people say these things, quickly, with a slight lowering of the voice, as though the word itself required handling. Eleanor did not look up his background that night, though she came close. She stopped herself. She went to bed and slept poorly, and was in the kitchen at 6 the next morning when Maria, who managed the household, came in and said, without preamble, that the man from yesterday was back in the garage. Had been since 5:30. And his daughter's with him, Maria said, settling a mug onto the counter. She's got a book and a blanket, and she set herself up in the corner chair like she owns it. I took her a muffin. She said thank you very politely, and then went straight back to her book. Eleanor stood in the kitchen for a moment. "Don't make anything of it," she said, and walked toward the garage. She heard it before she reached the door. Not the Jaguar. The Jaguar was still silent. What she heard was the particular sound of someone working alone, the kind of sounds that don't perform for an audience. The soft clink of a tool replaced carefully. A low murmur that was not quite words. More like a person thinking out loud below the threshold of language. She stopped in the doorway. The garage bay was lit with the overhead floods and two secondary work lights clipped to the car's frame. James was partially under the dash on his back, visible only from the knees down. His toolbox was open on the floor beside him, a battered red metal thing, the kind sold at hardware stores, covered on the inside lid, with stickers faded past legibility. In the corner, on the chair that Eleanor used sometimes when she sat with the car in the evenings, a small girl was curled with her knees, tucked up, and a paperback open in her lap. She had her father's dark hair and the focused, oblivious stillness of a child who is completely inside a book. The girl looked up when Eleanor stepped in. "Hi," she said. "I'm Fiona." "Eleanor," said Eleanor. "I know. Dad said this is your car. It is." Fiona considered the Jaguar with the gravity of someone taking it seriously. "It's very green," she said. "It is. Dad says the color is called British Racing Green, but it's not actually racing green. It's more like forest green with some gray in it. He said the factory was inconsistent with the color in '69. Eleanor looked at the pair of work boots visible beyond the car's front wheel. "You've already been talking to your father about it." "He was telling me about it on the drive over," Fiona said, and went back to her book. Eleanor told herself she would stay 15 minutes. She stayed 2.5 hours. There was something about the way James worked. She had watched at various points 8 of the 12 previous specialists. She had formed impressions of them all. The Vancouver team worked fast and with a certain performance of competence. The Stuttgart man was methodical, almost meditative. James worked like none of them. He was slow, unhurried in a way that, in another context, you might read as laziness, except that his attention was total. He was not consulting reference materials or talking to a teammate or pulling up schematics on a tablet. He was looking, running his fingers along wiring the way you read something by touch. At one point, he was flat on his back under the dash for close to 45 minutes without moving. At the 30-minute mark, Eleanor said. "Are you all right thinking?" he said. "You've been thinking for half an hour. It's a complicated thing to think about." She went back to the emails she was not really reading. At some point, Fiona had finished her book and was now lying on her stomach on a folded blanket in the corner, drawing something in a notebook with a green pencil. She drew in silence, occasionally glancing at the Jaguar, with the particular consideration of a child who is forming an independent opinion about something. Eventually, Eleanor stood to leave for a call. "I'll have someone bring you lunch," she said to the room generally. "We're okay," Fiona said without looking up. "We have sandwiches in the truck. Dad made them this morning before we left." "You ate at home?" "We ate in the truck, actually. Dad gets up early and makes things so we don't have to stop. He has a little camp stove he uses in the driveway sometimes." Eleanor looked toward the pair of boots. "A camp stove in the driveway. It's faster," James said from under the dash, not looking up. "And Fiona doesn't like drive-through." "I don't have a thing about it," Fiona said. "I just think it tastes like cardboard." "That's a thing. It's a preference." From under the car, a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Eleanor stood in the middle of this exchange and had the specific, slightly disorienting sensation of having stepped into a scene that had been running without her. She left for her call. Walking back toward the main house, she found herself, for the first time in a long time, thinking about something other than the Jaguar or the 11 failed attempts before this one. The day ended without resolution. James stayed until nearly 7. Fiona had long since moved back to her book, and then to a second book produced from her backpack, and then to a quiet, careful inspection of the tools in the open toolbox, which she conducted with the respectful seriousness of someone visiting a museum exhibit. Eleanor was crossing the garden when they came out. "Same time tomorrow," she said. James looked at her. "If that works. Did you find anything?" He paused the way she was beginning to recognize. The pause of someone who knows something and is sorting out how to say it accurately. "I found something," he said, "but I want to confirm it before I tell you. Because if I'm wrong, I'll sound like an idiot." Eleanor nodded. "Fair enough." Fiona tugged his sleeve. "Dad." He picked her up with one arm, easy, and she settled against his shoulder with the particular boneless comfort of a child who knows exactly how they fit against their parent. Walking to the truck, she said something quietly against his neck, and he tilted his head to hear her, and he said something back, and she laughed. The truck pulled out slowly. Eleanor stood on the path and watched it go. Then she went inside and ate dinner alone at the kitchen island. Something she had done most evenings, for longer than she cared to calculate, and she tried to remember when she had last heard a child's voice in this house, and found she couldn't locate it. He was back at 5:30 the next morning. Fiona was asleep in the passenger seat with her second book open on her lap and a knit hat pulled down over her ears. James sat in the truck for 15 minutes after he parked. Eleanor could see this on the small monitor in her study, which she happened to be passing, not watching. He was looking at something on the dashboard, or maybe at nothing. Just still, with his head tilted back slightly. She thought about those 15 minutes afterward, the quality of them, a person sitting with something before they were ready to carry it in. She was on a call with her accountant when she heard it. The sound came through the walls of the house and across the grounds and landed in the center of her chest like something physical. The Jaguar's engine turning over, once, catching, and then opening into a sound she had not heard since she was 12 years old. Not a start, a voice. Something between a roar and a song, enormous and real, for 4 seconds before it dropped back to idle. She was off the call before she understood she had ended it. She ran. This was not the way Eleanor Voss moved through the world. She walked with purpose and economy and the comfortable authority of a woman who had been in control of her own pace for 4 decades. She ran across the garden and around the east wing and through the side door of the garage bay with her good shoes on and slightly out of breath and stopped. The Jaguar's engine was running, idling, steady, alive. The sound it made at rest was lower than she remembered, a deep rolling thing she felt in her sternum and in the soles of her feet. The bay smelled of exhaust and old rubber and something underneath those things, something from the garage in Penticton, something that didn't have a name but had a location right below memory, in the part of the mind that stores experience without language. James was standing to the left of the car with his arms folded, watching the engine run. His expression was not triumph, not the look of a performer when the audience responds. It was more the look of a person who has seen something that was broken and important become not broken, and is feeling primarily the relief of that, and underneath the relief, something more private. Fiona was in the doorway. She had woken up. She was in her socks with her knit hat still on, and the second book in her hand, and her dark eyes moving between the car and her father. "You did it," she said. "It ran," James said carefully, like he was being precise about the distinction. Eleanor had not moved from the place she'd stopped when she came through the door. She was crying, not the managed, private grief she allowed herself sometimes. The other kind, the unplanned kind that doesn't check who's in the room first. Her hands came up to cover her face, and she stood there while the Jaguar idled and the September light came through the high windows, and Maria appeared in the doorway behind Fiona and stopped with both hands pressed to her mouth. James looked at Eleanor. He didn't say anything. Didn't tell her it was all right, didn't ask if she was okay, didn't perform the discomfort most people perform when someone else's emotion arrives unexpectedly and publicly. He simply let it be there, stood quietly while the engine ran, and Fiona, with the instinct of a child who understood things she hadn't been explicitly taught, slipped back to her corner chair and opened her book. Eleanor sat down on the floor of the garage, back against the workbench, knees pulled up. Maria quietly disappeared. The Jaguar idled with the patience of something that had been waiting a long time to demonstrate it. It was fine. James sat on an overturned crate a few feet away. Not close enough to crowd, not far enough to signal indifference. Some middle distance that managed to be both respectful and present. He looked at the engine and didn't try to fill the silence. After a while, Eleanor said, "I'm sorry for that." She gestured vaguely at her own face. "That wasn't very composed of you to witness." James looked at her sideways. "You're on your own property." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, which accomplished very little. He picked up a shop rag from the floor and held it out without comment. She took it. "My wife died," he said, 4 years ago. Complications. Fiona was 4. He said it the way he said most things, flat and plain, without the particular cautious handling that most people apply to very large facts. I drove back to the house that night and I sat in the truck in the driveway for a while. The neighbors could have seen me if they'd looked. I didn't care. He turned the crate slightly under his weight. "Some things make you cry. That's what they do." Eleanor looked at him. He was still watching the engine, not performing sympathy, just having said a true thing and returned his attention to what he was doing. "I didn't know that," she said, "about your wife. Not many people here do. I didn't come up here to be known. I came up here because Fiona needed a different pace. Vancouver wasn't it." Eleanor looked at the Jaguar. "What was her name?" Something shifted in his face, the slight opening of a door he didn't usually leave unlocked. Caitlin, he said. That's a good name. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. She had very strong opinions about cars, actually. She thought anyone who spent real money on a vehicle was being irrational. He paused. She would have found this entire situation very funny. From the corner, without looking up from her book, Fiona said, she was funny. James looked at his daughter with the expression of a parent who is proud and caught off guard in the same moment. Yes, she was, he said. Eleanor laughed. It was small and involuntary and surprised out of her, and it felt strange in her chest, the way laughing does when you've been crying recently, like two instruments playing in the same room without rehearsing. She wiped her face one more time. All right, she said. Tell me what you found. James set the shop rag on the crate and stood, and he walked to the engine bay and pointed to a section of wiring tucked along the passenger side firewall. A bundle of cables routed through a bracket that hadn't come with the original car. Whoever owned this before your father, he said, modified the electrical system. They added an aftermarket ignition enhancement kit. It was a common thing in the late 60s and early 70s. On cars like this, performance enthusiasts did it. The work was actually quite good. Sophisticated for the time. But the integration point here, he traced a line with his finger without touching it, created a ground path that wasn't in the original architecture. Over 50 years, the insulation on that section degraded. Not uniformly, not enough to show as a clear fault, just enough to create a variable resistance under a very specific condition. What condition? Engine temperature. During the warm-up cycle, when the engine bay reaches a certain heat threshold, the resistance in that ground path spikes just enough to confuse the ignition system. The system interprets it as a sensor anomaly and interrupts the start sequence before the engine can complete it. So it was never going to start under normal diagnostic conditions. He straightened up. Every tool those other specialists brought was looking for a discrete fault. A failed component, a broken connection, a clear short. There wasn't one. There was a degraded section of a modified ground path hidden under the original harness sleeve in a vehicle that wasn't documented as having any modifications. Because your father likely never knew it had them. He bought it as a restored car. Eleanor stared at him. How did you find it? I wasn't looking for a fault. He leaned back against the workbench. I was looking at how everything connected, the whole picture. When you look at the behavior of the whole system, instead of testing individual components, the pattern shows up. The car always failed in the same way, at the same point in the warm-up sequence. That kind of consistency means the cause is in a fixed location doing a fixed thing. Once I understood what the pattern meant, finding the location was just time. $900,000, Eleanor said slowly. 12 specialists. He looked at her. The other teams were working from each other's documentation by the end. Everyone was looking in the places the previous teams had already looked, trying to find what they'd missed. Nobody started fresh. He paused. Also, I knew this modification. I'd seen it before. On another car. There was something in that sentence. A small weight behind it. She filed it away. What did the actual repair take? About an hour once I found it. I rerouted the ground path, replaced the degraded section with period-appropriate wiring, removed the redundant components from the aftermarket kit. Eleanor was quiet. James, she said, how do you know about period-appropriate wiring for a 1969 Jaguar Series 2? He looked at her. It was the first time she'd seen him look even slightly caught. I used to work in automotive engineering, he said, a long time ago. She waited. He looked at the engine for a moment, the expression of a person deciding how much of something to give. I was a lead systems engineer at a firm in Vancouver, he said. We did contract work with manufacturers, European brands mostly, classic and performance vehicles. I was on a project that involved this generation of Jaguar. The ignition modification you're looking at was common on a subset of these cars. I'd traced a version of the same failure pattern 10 years ago on another E-Type with the same aftermarket kit. Different symptom, same underlying mechanism. That's why I recognized it when you described it. Eleanor was very still. Why didn't you? She started, stopped, reformulated. You've been working on this property for how long? About 6 months. In that time, why didn't you say anything? Apply for something at your level. Tell someone you had this background. He looked at the window. The specific look of a person who has had some version of this question before, in their own head, late at night. Because I left that industry completely, he said. After Caitlin died, I walked away from my position, turned down contract offers. I needed to be fully present for Fiona, and I couldn't do that and be what that work required. The hours, the travel. I didn't have anything left over for it. Property maintenance let me control my schedule. I could take Fiona to school. I could be home by a certain time. I could take a Friday afternoon off when she needed me without anyone losing a project deadline. He said it without apology, without the self-consciousness of someone who knows their choices look like underachievement from the outside. Grief does something to your priorities, he said. The things I used to care about, the career, the title, being the youngest person to do whatever, they stopped meaning anything. Fiona meant something. Everything else was just filling time around her. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She had run hiring processes for dozens of senior positions. She had sat across from very accomplished people and evaluated them with a precision that was, she knew, partially cold. She was good at reading what people were constructing about themselves. She did not think James was constructing anything. He was telling her a true thing in the plainest available language with no interest in how it reflected on him. The last specialist, she said, Dr. Halley. He published a monograph on British sports car electrical systems. He spent 11 days and didn't find it. You spent a day and a half. He was also working from 12 teams of documentation, James said. I know what you told me, but that's not all of it. You had specific knowledge that wasn't in any academic paper. You'd seen this exact modification fail before. He didn't argue. Which means, she said, you've been here for 6 months with knowledge that no one else I hired had. And you've been servicing gutters and checking drainage. His expression shifted. Not embarrassed, not defensive, something closer to tired. The tiredness of a person who has visited this particular recognition before and has some complicated feelings about it. I'm qualified on paper, he said. Practically, I've been out of the industry for 4 years. The technology has moved. My certification's lapsed. My professional contacts are gone or moved on. All of that is fixable. Maybe. He looked at the Jaguar. They weren't my priority. The engine idled between them, patient, steady, unaware of what it had started. From the corner, Fiona's voice came without her looking up. Dad, can we get real breakfast somewhere after? Not the granola bars. We have granola bars in the truck, James told Eleanor. We always have granola bars in the truck, Fiona said. They're fine, but they're not breakfast. I'll have someone make eggs, Eleanor said. From the corner, immediate. What kind of eggs? Any kind you like. Fiona looked up from her book for the first time in some while. The expression on her face was one of someone doing rapid and serious calculations. Scrambled, she said, with cheese. James said, you don't ask the person what they have first. I'm asking what they can do. She just said any kind, so she can do scrambled with cheese. Eleanor said, Maria can absolutely do scrambled with cheese. See, Fiona said, and returned to her book. James looked at Eleanor. She was smiling. She didn't entirely know when that had happened. The story came out the following morning. A member of the grounds crew had taken a video on his phone, the Jaguar running, Eleanor with her hands over her face in the doorway, and posted it to 3 platforms before anyone thought to say something about it. By noon, it had been picked up by 2 lifestyle sites. By evening, a television crew had parked outside the estate gate. Eleanor found out from her assistant and then went and found James, who was finishing work on the irrigation system on the south grounds, and told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How bad? It's moving fast. I need to know what they're going to find when they look at your background, because they will look. I'd rather hear it from you first. Something moved across his face. Not fear. The expression of someone watching the invisibility they'd carefully maintained over 4 years dissolve in real time. He told her about the firm, about the Jaguar project, about Caitlin. Not all of it, not in one conversation, but enough. He told her about why he'd left and what he'd done instead, and how Fiona understood more of it than he sometimes credited. When he was done, Eleanor said, I can manage the press contact if you want. Put out a statement, limit access, keep cameras off your personal address. Why would you do that? Because you fixed my father's car, she said, and because I had you on this property for 6 months and never once asked who you were or what you'd done. She looked at the hedge he'd been trimming. That's on me. A pause. The statement, he said, if it keeps Fiona's school out of it. Yes, that's enough. She nodded. Consider it done. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the faintest possible trace of something wry, Am I still employed here? Eleanor looked at him. We're going to have a conversation about that. It won't be about grounds maintenance. He looked at her steadily. My certifications are, James, she said. I've been investing in property developments for 30 years. I know what's possible when someone decides to make it possible. The question of what you want is separate. But don't tell me what's fixable. That's not your department. He seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he said, You're very direct. Yes. Is it always like this? It gets more direct when I'm interested in something. He nodded once, the nod of someone storing information. I'll think about it, he said. All right. He picked up his tools. At the edge of the garden, he stopped. The car, he said, not turning around. You should drive it, not in the parking area. Actually drive it on a real road. He paused. He would have wanted that. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment after he left. He was right. He had been right about everything so far. That was something she was going to have to get used to. The conversation she owed him happened the following Monday, in the kitchen, not the office, because the office felt wrong for what she wanted to say. Maria had made a full breakfast. James ate it the way he did most things, steadily, without hurry, without performing ease. He had Fiona with him because it was a school holiday, and Fiona had already assessed the kitchen, complimented the ceiling height, asked whether the bookshelves in the hall were organized by color or subject, and established herself at the table with a library book she had brought from home. Eleanor laid out what she was thinking. A consulting position, based here in the Okanagan, structured around a specific schedule he could count on. Monday through Thursday with Fridays protected. Hours in writing. Flexibility that was real rather than nominal. And if it didn't hold in practice, she owed him 18 months of salary. It would go in the contract. James listened without interrupting. He said, I'd need to recertify properly, not rush it. Agreed. And I need to talk to Fiona, not because she gets a vote, but because she's been the person everything's been organized around for 4 years, and if her life is going to change, she should understand why. Eleanor nodded. That's good parenting. It's just what works, he said. He looked at his coffee. She asked me last week whether we were doing something different soon. She picks things up. She does, Eleanor agreed, glancing toward the hall where Fiona was auditing the bookshelves. He set his cup down. One more thing. He said it carefully. When things go wrong, because they will, I've been out of this industry for 4 years, and there will be times when the rust shows. What happens? Eleanor looked at him. I tell you directly there's a problem. You tell me directly there's a problem. We fix it without performing competence we don't have. He held her gaze. I have a hard time with people who aren't straight with me. So do I, she said. That's something we have in common. He was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand across the table. 1 week, he said. I'll call you. She shook it. 1 week. He stood, said, Tell Maria the eggs were perfect in the general direction of the hallway, and collected Fiona from the bookshelves, which she had determined were organized incorrectly. By author's death date, Fiona informed her father while pulling on her jacket would make more chronological sense. That's a strong opinion about someone else's library. I'm just observing. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window and watched them cross to the truck. James held the passenger door while Fiona climbed in, still talking, and he said something that made her laugh, and the truck pulled slowly down the drive. Maria peered at Eleanor's shoulder. She should come back, Maria said. That girl should come back here. She probably will, Eleanor said. He called on Sunday, 6 days after Monday, close enough to a week that it didn't feel like he was making her wait. He said, I talked to Fiona. How did it go? She had 4 questions. The first one was whether she could still bring her books. The second was whether there would be eggs. The third was about the schedule, specifically whether Thursdays were protected because she has a reading club after school on Thursdays, and he always picks her up. And the fourth one, he paused. She asked me if I actually wanted to do it, or whether I thought I should. What did you tell her? I told her both things were true. That sometimes you want something and feel like you should do it, and they're the same thing rather than opposite things. What did she say to that? She said, okay, and then asked if we could get a better shower curtain, because ours is depressing. Eleanor sat down on the porch step with her coffee. So she's on board. She's on board, he said, and I've made a list of conditions. Good, tell me. The schedule in writing, specific hours, not just flexible in principle. Thursdays protected always. The recertification at my pace, not the pace of whatever press narrative is still running. And during recertification, I'm not available for media. Agreed. Agreed, agreed. And I'll tell my communications person firmly. He was quiet for a moment. The stillness of someone who has said the important things and is now checking whether he's missed anything. The car, he said. Have you driven it yet? Once, she said. Up the South Road. Just to the orchard and back. How was it? She looked at the hills behind the property. Gold with the beginning of October. Like he built it for himself, she said. And then left it for me. James was quiet. Yeah, he said. That sounds about right. Send me the contract, he said. I'll sign it when it's right. She sent it that evening. He signed it 4 days later, at 11 at night, and she saw the notification on her phone while she was reading in bed. She set the book down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Good, she thought. Just that. Good. The fall moved the way falls do in the Okanagan, in long gold days that get shorter and colder without asking. James came 3 days a week. He worked in the study she'd had set up in the East Wing, a room with a long table and a whiteboard that ran the length of one wall, which he filled within 2 weeks of arriving. He was recertifying through a program in Kelowna, 2 evenings a week, and Saturday mornings while Fiona had swimming lessons. Fiona came on Fridays. This had not been formally arranged. It had simply started happening. James picked her up from school and came by on his way to wherever they were going next. And Fiona had at some point established a standing practice of sitting at the kitchen table with Maria and talking about her week in considerable detail, while Eleanor worked in the next room and could hear every word through the open door, which she did not close. The Friday in November, when Fiona announced that her class was doing a unit on Canadian geography, and that she personally felt the Great Lakes were overemphasized relative to the interior lake systems, Eleanor came through from the study and sat at the table, and they had a 20-minute conversation about Lake Okanagan that ended with Fiona asking whether the Ogopogo was real. I think the lake is real, Eleanor said. Whether what's in it is real is a different question. That's a very careful answer, Fiona said. I work in real estate. Careful answers are a professional habit. Fiona considered this. Dad says you're one of the sharpest people he's worked with. Eleanor looked at him. He was standing by the counter with his coffee and the expression of a man who had not intended for that to be repeated. I said that, he agreed, without apology. In December, a journalist Eleanor trusted asked to do a piece about the Depth Access Initiative, which is what Eleanor had started calling the thing she'd been building in her head since October. The concept was simple enough to fit in a paragraph and complicated enough to take years. A formal review process, at every level of her company and her property holdings, designed to surface the full professional and educational background of every person employed, regardless of their current role. Not a mentorship program, not a goodwill exercise. A genuine structural acknowledgement that the frame you hire someone in is almost never the full picture of who they are. The first cohort was 31 people, among them a groundskeeper at the Kelowna property who had practiced as a structural engineer in Alberta before a divorce and a custody arrangement required him to move, a housekeeper at the Penticton estate who had completed 3 years of a nursing degree before a family crisis interrupted it, and who had been quietly, informally, doing basic medical support for elderly neighbors on her days off for 6 years. A man in the accounting department who had spent 12 years as a high school physics teacher before the school district eliminated his position, and who had been solving internal data problems in his spare time, using methods that made 2 senior analysts sit quietly for a long time after he explained them. None of these were exceptional people, Eleanor said, when the journalist asked her what connected them. That's the entire point. These are ordinary people who'd been seen only through one window. We hadn't thought to look through the others. James read the piece on his phone in the kitchen on a Tuesday morning and didn't say anything about it to Eleanor when she came through. But she saw that he'd folded the corner of the page down on the printed copy she'd left on the table, which was, she had come to understand, his version of a considerable response. April came with the smell of pine and thawed lake. Fiona had turned 9 in March, with the particular confidence of someone who had been waiting for 9 specifically and found it satisfying. She had her father's patience, and what Eleanor had come to understand was her mother's willingness to occupy a room. She brought her homework and her library books and her opinions about documentary series, and she asked Eleanor questions about her father's work that were either very perceptive or very direct, depending on how you looked at it, and sometimes both. She asked one afternoon in April whether Eleanor missed her father. Eleanor said yes. What do you miss most? She thought about it honestly. The way he talked about the things he cared about, she said. He wasn't a man who talked about himself much, but when he got on a subject he loved, you knew it. The whole shape of him changed. Fiona was quiet for a moment. Dad's like that about engines, she said, and about me. He doesn't talk about himself much either, but when he talks about us, he changes shape. Eleanor looked at her. That's a very precise thing to notice, she said. I read a lot, Fiona said, and turned back to her book. On a Saturday in late April, Eleanor was in the garage with her coffee, reading a report she'd promised herself she'd finish before the week started. The Jaguar was there, pointing at the door the way it always did now, the way something points when it's ready to go somewhere. She had driven it 7 times since September, once with James, once with Fiona in the back seat, who had spent the entire drive asking questions about differential gears that James answered in the patient, specific way he answered all of her questions, which was as though she were a junior colleague rather than a 9-year-old. Once, alone, at dusk, up through the hills behind the property, where the road curved and fell, and the lake appeared in pieces through the trees, and she had let it go on the straightaway, properly, fully, with the windows down, and the sound of the engine filling the air around her. And she had thought about her father in the driveway in Penticton, beaming, and she had driven on. The side door opened, and James came in with 2 coffees. He sat on the crate he'd been sitting on in September, handed her one. You've been in here more lately, he said. She looked at the Jaguar. It doesn't feel like his absence anymore, she said. It feels like just the car. Something he loved that I can love separately. He nodded. The nod of someone who understood this from the inside. After a while, he said, Fiona asked me something last night. She waited. She asked if we were a family. The 3 of us. The garage was quiet. What did you tell her? He turned his coffee cup slowly. I told her I wasn't sure what word we were using yet, but that some things are real before they have a word. He looked up. She said she was going to use the word anyway, quietly to herself, just so she had something to call it. Eleanor looked at him. There were things she could say. She was aware of all of them. The careful ones, the ones that held the proper distance, the ones she'd been fluent in for a long time. What word do you think she's using? She said, something in his face. The door a little further open than usual. I think she's using family, he said. Eleanor looked at the Jaguar, at the green paint catching the morning light, at the door pointing toward the road, and the hills beyond it, and all the distance that was still possible. I think she's right, she said. It was not a large moment. The coffee was going cold. One of the fluorescent overheads had been flickering for a week, and still hadn't been fixed. James had a grass stain on his jacket from something earlier in the week that he clearly hadn't noticed. Outside, a robin was making a lot of noise in the hedge by the south gate. But it was true. Between 2 people who had each spent a significant portion of their lives in the company of untrue things, things that were called something they weren't, distance that was called independence, silence that was called composure. The true thing, plainly said in a cold garage on an April morning, landed with a weight that the larger gestures never quite managed. They drank their coffee. The Jaguar sat between them, patient and green, pointing at the door. Later that afternoon, all 3 of them drove it. Up through the hills, windows down, Fiona in the back, with her sunglasses on asking about the mechanics of the gearbox, in terms that suggested she had been doing independent research, which James confirmed she had. Eleanor drove. She took the hill road past the orchard and the viewpoint above the lake, and when the road opened up, she let the engine have what it wanted, properly, with full intention, and the sound of it came up through the seat and the wheel and the floor and filled the car completely. From the back seat, Fiona said softly, "Oh, just that." The sound of someone encountering something real and not yet having the language for it. James glanced at Eleanor. She kept her eyes on the road, but she was smiling and he could see it. She drove. The lake appeared below them, blue and enormous in the April afternoon, the kind of afternoon that makes you feel briefly that things are exactly as large as they are and no larger. She thought about her father in the driveway at 12 years old. The beaming. The boy he still had in him at 78. The car he'd built over 11 years. The things he'd kept so carefully that he had never quite let himself use. She thought about what James had said in September. He would have wanted that. She drove and let the engine go and thought, I know, Dad. I'm using it. Not recklessly. Not without care, but fully, the way things that matter deserve to be used. The way a life deserves to be used. Without the careful economy of someone saving themselves for a safer moment that never comes. The road bent back toward the valley. She stayed in it. When they got back to the estate, and Fiona climbed out of the back seat and stood in the driveway taking off her sunglasses, she had the expression of someone completing a very serious internal inventory. "I want to learn how the engine works," she said. "Not just basically. Properly." James looked at Eleanor. "Some of it I can teach you," Eleanor said. "Some of it you'll have to ask your father." Fiona looked at her father. "Can we start Saturday?" James said. "Saturday we have swimming. After swimming," he rubbed the back of his neck. "Sure, after swimming." Fiona put her sunglasses in her pocket. "Good." She looked at the Jaguar one more time, the particular look of someone who has decided something. Then she went inside to find Maria and tell her about the gearbox. James stood beside the car for a moment. Eleanor stood beside him. The late afternoon light was doing what it did over the lake in April, long and copper and slightly unreal. "He was terrified of it," she said. "My father. He spent 11 years building this car, and then he was so careful with it he never really drove it." James said he respected it. He was afraid of breaking something he loved. He looked at the hills. "Some people are." She looked at the car. "I used to tease him about it when I was older. I told him the point of a beautiful thing was to use it, not to preserve it." "What did he say?" She smiled. "He said some things were worth being careful with." She paused. "I thought he meant the car." James looked at her. "He meant you," he said. It wasn't a question. She was quiet for a moment. "I know that now," she said. They stood together in the late afternoon, while the engine ticked and cooled and the robin in the hedge started up again, and somewhere down the road, the lake caught the last of the light and held it.